Well, welcome to One Verse. Today we have Todd Hostetler. He's the pastor at City on a Hill Teaching Center. We also have Jeff Millslegal. He is a Bible study teacher at City on a Hill. They're about to discuss a verse I give them. It is a random verse. They do not know ahead of time what it's going to be. And Todd, you get to go first this time. This is an Old Testament verse. It is Psalm 78, verse 38. That says, "But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and he did not destroy them. Yes, many a time he turned his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath." So that's Psalm 78, verse 38.
Well, this probably should be one that Jeff went to first, just because Jeff is so passionate about Psalms. So I'm interested to see what Jeff says about Psalm 78, verse number 38. But Psalm 78 is talking about just God's heart, his empathy, his kindness to his people, even though his people have rebelled against him. And in verse number 38, I'm going to read it again. "But he, God, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and did not destroy them. Yet many a time he turned his anger away, and he did not stir up all of his wrath." You know, this in a nutshell really just describes for us exactly who God is. And this is the great loving nature of God. So many times, this is telling us there's so many times that Israel had turned their hearts away from God and deserved his wrath, because they had not only turned away from God, time and time again, they turned their hearts towards false gods. They gave their lives over to idols, just carved pieces of wood or stone, and rejected God who had been so faithful to them. And yet time and time again, God had mercy upon them. And time again, he would turn his wrath away. This is the nature of God. This is important for us to understand, because in our lives today, we all know the times that we have fallen short of who we're supposed to be as followers of Jesus. We know the times that we have just outright chosen to live in sin and rebellion against God and against Jesus Christ, who gave his life for us. We know we've done that. But it's good for us to always remember and have this remembrance that this is who God is. God has a heart not to destroy. When you look through the Old Testament, a good example would be King Ahab, one of the worst kings. Arguably, at the time, he was. The Bible says he was the worst king up until that time. And I think it was either 17 or 21 years. God, this was an evil man who did evil upon evil and turned the hearts of the nation of Israel away from God. And yet God was patient. And God gave 17 years. He would bring prophets to speak to him, give him a chance to turn. Now, eventually, God did destroy him. But it just shows how God has a heart that he doesn't want wrath to come. But now here's the important thing. Sin does require, there is wrath that is required of sin. And here's the beautiful picture. We see this picture in Psalm of God turning away from wrath, because he chooses to operate in forgiveness and mercy and grace and love. This is exactly who Jesus Christ is. You know, the Bible tells us that Jesus is the one who drank the cup of God's wrath. The Bible gives the illustration of a cup of God's wrath, and it says that Jesus drank the wrath to the dregs, to the very bottom. He drank in all of the wrath of God so that you and I don't have to. It is a picture of the heart of Jesus Christ. So when you think back and reflect upon your failures and the times you have fallen short, listen, you can turn right back to Jesus, because he's never left you. He's always right there beside you. He's never judged you or condemned you, because when you gave your heart to Jesus, he took all of that. You are no longer under that judgment. So if you feel like you've failed, remember, God is a heart of grace and mercy. Turn back to him, and you will walk in that grace and mercy, and he will advance you forward in him. Jeff, talk to us about Psalm 78.
My grandmother was a great reader. I don't even know if this magazine's still made anymore, but Reader's Digest, and she would get it, and usually like the last quarter of Reader's Digest was a condensed version of a book, and she just loved those things. Psalm 78 is the Reader's Digest version of most of the Old Testament. It starts out talking about Israel's early days, and then it's going to move into as they're leaving Egypt. And really from verse 12 through verse 39, it's basically talking about the struggle they had in the wilderness and so on. And then from verse 40 on to really towards almost to the end of the chapter, because there's 72 verses, right? 72 verses in this particular chapter, yeah. And covering the history of Israel. Now, what I love about this, you can kind of walk through, and so many people have a concept of God was this almost kind of this mean, angry sort of deity that was just throwing fireballs down on people if they weren't listening and paying attention and all that sort of stuff. And there's nothing like that. It's true. And you could see this here in Psalm 78 because it goes through their history all the times that God redeemed them or helped them or rescued them, and yet they would still sin again. So I could, you could just go through and pull out different things about how he starts out here with basically in the middle part of this, early in their wilderness wandering, how Moses struck the rock instead of spoke to the rock. And yet, verse 24, how God rained down, I love that, rained down manna on them to eat, gave them bread of heaven, and he caused an east wind to blow into heavens and brought the south winds. He talks about raining meat there in verse 27, and how they ate and were filled. And then verse 32, in spite of this, they still sinned. So you have all this background going on. So when you get to verse 38, but he, that's the Lord, being full of compassion, that's a perfect word here, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and did not destroy them. There's a common theme you'll see in the Old Testament where it starts out in Exodus 34, I think it's verse 4, where it talks about, here's the description of God, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And you see that phrase or something like that over and over multiple times in the Old Testament. Not only in Exodus, it's in Deuteronomy, it's in Psalms, it's in the minor prophets. And it basically, here's one of these. He is being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity. Now, I read the stories of the Old Testament, and particularly like in Numbers, I'm thinking like Numbers 10, different places like that where the people go to rebellion. And I'm thinking, if I'm God, I've had it with these people. Boom, that's the end of them. But that's not how the Lord's operating here, because he's what? He's full of compassion and forgave their iniquity and did not destroy them. Yes, many times you turn to anger away and did not stir up all his wrath. See, it's God is, even the God of the Old Testament, which we don't think this way, he is full of love and mercy towards his people. You know what he wants? He wants this broken and contrite heart. That also shows up later in Psalms and in Isaiah, where you want a broken and contrite heart before him. That's the thing that Israel always struggled with. They always wanted to do it on their own, but they really needed to be submitting to him. So anyhow, that's Psalm 78. I could spend so much time in Psalm 78. This is just a wonderful microcosm of the Old Testament. What you got there, Todd? Wrap us up.
Well, when you go to the very end of Psalm 78, this is talking about David. And it talks about how God chose David as his servant, took him from the sheepfolds. And then you go down to the very last verse, still talking about David. It says, so he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. So this is using David as an example and saying that he took David as a shepherd from the sheepfold, and David, with the goodness of his heart, having a heart after God, shepherded the people in the right direction. Well, David is a type. He is a shadow of Jesus Christ, who is the great shepherd. And so when you read this entire psalm and you see that God, listen, if you are beating yourself up because of your failures, because of the times you have fallen short, this ends with the picture of Jesus Christ, who is the good shepherd and who loves you and has made his way to you to gently, just turn your heart back to him. He gently then will lead you back skillfully in the direction that he has for you. It is Psalm 78, full of beauty, full of encouragement. Read it, as Jeff said, read it today and be encouraged. Donna, thank you. Jeff, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next time on One Verse.